Stop the War Coalition has just launched a campaign of defence and support for some of the Stop the War activists who are being falsely prosecuted by the police for violence, when in actual fact it should be some of the police that should be prosecuted for violence against the demonstrators. I think that it's very important that the Stop the War movement keeps going. There are 4,000 troops, British troops in Iraq still, and there are over 100,000 American troops in Iraq, and I think that we're wrong if we think that those troops are just going to leave without being forced to leave. America's got very real reasons for being in Iraq, very real reasons for its strategic development in terms of its wanting the resources there. It's spent billions of pounds building 4 huge American bases. It's not going to withdraw its troops unless it's forced to withdraw its troops, in my opinion. I think largely the Stop the War movement has won the argument with most people in this country. Most people in this country think that the war in Iraq was wrong, that we were lied to about the reasons that the government said we were going to war in Iraq. I think most people accept that now, and the majority of people do want the troops to come home. But because Iraq's not very high profile in the media at the moment, it's easy for people to think that that's just going to happen. It's not going to happen unless the pressure is kept on the government to make it happen. And I think the best way to keep pressure on the government is to be a visible movement, and the best way for us to be visible is to be out on the streets. And that's why I think the big demonstrations are very important. It's where we express our strength as a movement, even though there are lots of other things that we do behind the scene. I think the other important issue at the moment is Afghanistan. There's a lot of pressure on the British government and on European governments to send more troops to Afghanistan. The Americans want there to be a big push in Afghanistan, and it's, in a lot of ways, it's portrayed as the good war, as the war that we can win, as the war that is helping Afghani people. And I think that the Stop the War movement's got a big role to play in exposing those arguments for the lies that they are. I mean, thousands and thousands of Afghanistani people have been killed. I mean, people are being killed every week. If you look very, very carefully in the small print of the newspapers, you will see that a wedding party's being bombed, a village is being bombed. 50 people at a time have been killed by the British or the Americans dropping bombs from the sky on the Afghani people. There's a massive humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan. There's not enough food for people to eat. The aid agencies are warning of massive starvation. Now, this is after 7 years of foreign occupation. Clearly, the foreign occupation is not doing anything to help ordinary Afghani people. There's talks of reconstruction, but that's largely illusionary. There's some reconstruction in Kabul where they built 5-star hotels for the foreign contractors to stay while they try and make a profit out of what's going on in Afghanistan. There's a golf course, but ordinary reconstruction on the ground is never going to be delivered by a foreign occupation force who's got no interest, who doesn't really care about the Afghani people at all. If they did, they wouldn't bomb them and kill them so indiscriminately. They're not there to benefit the Afghani people. And it's not a war that can be won. The UK ambassador says that it's not a war that can be won, and the UK ambassador to Afghanistan says that. The UK military commander to Afghanistan says that we need to talk to the Taliban, which is seen as being the main resistance fighters to the foreign occupation. And, as much as people may abhor what the Taliban stand for, they are seen as being the resistance, and people who want to oppose the occupation are going to draw the Taliban, are going to be drawn towards the Taliban. The longer the occupation lasts, the stronger the Taliban is going to get, because they're seen as the resistance fighters. So the Stop the War movement's got a fantastic role to play in raising these issues, in staying on the streets, in forcing our politicians to, well, A, we want our troops withdrawn from Afghanistan, but B, we want to keep the pressure on so they don't feel like they can get away with sending more troops. I mean, the lies need to be exposed. But we haven't got a hope in hell of winning in Afghanistan, even if it was something that we should morally be winning. The Russians in the 80s had 1 million troops in Afghanistan over the course of the 80s. 50,000 Russian troops were killed. Estimates of about 1 million Afghanis were killed, though obviously people don't bother to count Afghani deaths. I mean, why do Afghanis matter? We don't count them at the moment. But you can see that, and this brought the Soviet Union to its knees. You can see that it's not a war that can be won. It won't be won because rightly the British and the Americans are seen as foreign invaders, and rightly that invasion is being resisted. and that's going to happen. We're not wanted there, and our troops' lives shouldn't be wasted in Afghanistan. You know, we shouldn't be sending young boys to fight in a war that is immoral and unjust. You know, the troops should be brought home, and the Afghani people should be allowed to try and rebuild their country, and obviously their own massive reparation from the invaders that have destroyed so much of it. However well-meaning individual soldiers may be, it doesn't detract from the fact that when they're being resisted by resistance forces in Afghanistan that don't want their country to be occupied by foreign invaders, the British and the Americans are resorting to bombing from the air. Obviously during the war in 2001, where they were bombing from the air all the time, you know, they used terrible weapons like daisy cutters, which sound so nice, but, you know, blow people to bits, and, you know, 500-pound bombs, which have got a casualty radius of half a mile. I mean, you know, obscene weaponry that they've used. You can't win hearts and minds by bombing villages, and I think that the UK ambassador knows that, and the UK head of the army knows that, so I don't think that's very controversial. You can't win this war. You can't win a war for hearts and minds. It's a contradiction in terms, and I think however well-meaning individual soldiers might be, it's not a moral war, and our soldiers shouldn't be put in that situation, and that all of the troops should be withdrawn. It's quite difficult because it's quite easy to portray the anti-war movement as being against the troops, and it's a way that you can be attacked on the streets and things like that. One of the really important things that arose in this anti-war movement, which has been quite unique, is Military Families Against the War, and it was founded by a woman called Rose Gentle, whose son was sort of seduced into the army as like a young teenage lad in Glasgow, was sent to Iraq, was killed after not being there for very long, just been there for a few months, Gordon Gentle. And Tony Blair refused to meet with Rose Gentle and Gordon's sister, and he still never met with her. You know, he sent her son to die, and yet he refused to meet with her. And she formed Military Families Against the War, and a lot of other parents whose sons had died in the war joined, and it began to attract people whose sons were in the army at the moment, who hadn't died, but they just wanted to campaign against the war, and Military Families Against the War was an umbrella group that they could be part of. And it started to attract soldiers as well, and soldiers have joined Military Families Against the War, but as being soldiers against the war. And that's been quite unique to this war, and that's been really important in defending the anti-war movement against the charge that it's against the troops, or that we want our troops to be killed. We don't want our troops to be killed, we want our troops to be taken out of a situation where they can be killed. They shouldn't be there, and we want the troops to come home, and that is our way of supporting the troops, not by saying, you know, you're doing a good job, boys, but by saying, you know, you should never have been sent there by the government and you need to come home.